In a previous episode, I mentioned that before a character defect can be removed, it must first clearly be seen. That naturally raises another question. How did I learn to see it? Several months ago, through meditation, the light of consciousness gradually brought the nature of a particular character defect into my awareness. I was preparing to return to the dentist to find out whether tooth number 31 would require a root canal, and I was very afraid. I had been suffering from fear surrounding the tooth for the past 7 months, and it had caused nothing but suffering. So I decided to go into meditation. During my practice, a vision arose on the movie screen of my mind. I found myself inside of a courtroom. My higher power was presiding. The light of consciousness stood beside me. The character defect of fear was called to the witness stand. My higher power asked, "Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Fear answered, "I do." Then the light of consciousness asked, "What would this fellow traveler's life look like if you remained?" Fear began listing everything it would affect: my health, my moods, my relationships, my practices, my studies, my art, this podcast, my service to others. As fear testified, I could see that it would taint every part of my life and every person I came into contact with. Then the light of consciousness asked, "And what would this fellow traveler's life look like if you were gone?" I would be in the flow of life, living life on life's terms, no longer constantly trying to orchestrate every move, no longer making decisions based on fear or past experiences, no longer projecting other people's experiences onto my own as though their future would somehow become mine, no longer needing to control every outcome or the people in my life. My energy could flow freely. The pain would fade. The tension would subside. The craving for certainty would loosen its grip. The teeth grinding would stop. No more endless anticipation. No more living with an undercurrent of fear. I could simply be present. I could simply be. And that's when I began to see fear had never been protecting me. It had been holding me hostage. That's when I realized this wasn't the first time fear had been sitting in the driver's seat. As long as I could remember, fear had quietly been dictating my thoughts, my emotions, my motor center, my instincts, and my actions. It had always been whispering its sweet nothings into my ear, promising to keep me safe, promising to take care of me, promising that if I just thought hard enough, I could somehow prevent myself from suffering. But as I sat there, I realized that had been the greatest lie of all. Fear had promised to protect me, yet it had caused so much of the suffering I had experienced. Then I realized The tooth wasn't where the story began, it was simply where my suffering reached a crescendo. The truth was, this story hadn't begun weeks earlier, or even months before, or even years back. It had begun decades before that. I had become addicted to alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs. At the time, I believed the mind altering substances were the root of my problem. I couldn't have been more mistaken. They had become my way of soothing the suffering. They never removed my suffering, they only buried it. When I got sober, I thought the story had ended. In many ways, it had only just begun. The craving had simply shifted its focus. Instead of craving alcohol and drugs, I found myself craving all sorts of things. But above all, certainty. I wanted to know how everything would turn out. I wanted to prevent suffering before it happened. I wanted to control the uncontrollable. And that's when I couldn't, rather, that's when I allowed fear to step in. It promised to protect me. It promised to keep me safe. It promised that if I had thought hard enough, I could somehow avoid what life had in store. But every time I fed it my attention, my body paid the price. And that's when I began to wonder, had the craving ever really left? Or had it become a shapeshifter, making it more difficult to recognize? I was no longer reaching for alcohol or cocaine or other drugs. I was reaching for certainty. I wanted to know how everything would turn out. I wanted to eliminate uncertainty. I wanted to prevent suffering before it happened. So, whenever life refused to cooperate, I gave my attention to fear. And every time I fed it my attention, my body paid the price. That's when I began to see what I was craving had changed, but the same undercurrent remained. No matter what I reached for, the promise was always identical. They were the familiar, sweet nothings I had heard all along, only now the ventriloquist had picked up a different puppet. Then a new question arose. Who was the ventriloquist? That question stayed with me. If fear was merely the puppet, then what had been speaking through it? If alcohol had been a puppet, and cocaine another puppet, and certainty another puppet, who was pulling the strings? I had spent years changing the puppet, but never questioning the hand that held it. That's when I began to look deeper, not at the puppet, not even at the ventriloquist, but at what gave the ventriloquist its power. For a while, I didn't have an answer. I only had more questions. If I removed one puppet, why did another one always appear? Why did fear take the place of alcohol? Why did certainty take the place of fear? It seemed as though something was always waiting behind the curtain. No matter which puppet was taken away, another one was ready to step onto the stage. Then it dawned on me. Maybe I had been asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, who is the ventriloquist? Perhaps I should have been asking, what gives the ventriloquist its voice? Then it occurred to me, maybe both the puppet and the ventriloquist were distractions. As long as my attention was fixed on either one, I would have never, I would never discover what gave the ventriloquist its voice. So I turned my attention away from the puppet, away from the ventriloquist, and for the first time, I began to observe the voice itself. Not what it said, not who it spoke through, but how I reacted to the voice. That's when I noticed it always promised the same thing: relief, safety, control, certainty. It didn't matter whether the promise was pleasure or relief, whether it was control or certainty. The promises kept changing, but the reaction never did. That was the part I had been missing. For years, I had been looking at the puppet: alcohol, drugs, fear, one character defect after another, but never at my own reaction to the voice. Every time I reacted, the voice became more demanding. Every time I gave it my attention, it grew stronger. I wasn't moving toward freedom. I was chasing my own tail, strengthening the very groove I was trying to escape. The more I gave it my attention, the more I fed it. The more I fed it, the more it demanded. The more it demanded, the deeper my reaction became. And the cycle continued. That night, I had a lot to think about. Before going to bed, I brought it all to divinity. I asked if there was anything I still needed to see, anything I had missed, anything that needed to be understood more clearly. Then, the following morning, in the quiet space between dreaming and waking, as I was returning to my physical body from the dream state, a familiar melody rose up from the depths of consciousness. The Pointer Sisters, Automatic. The words that kept repeating were, "No way to control it. It's totally automatic." At first, I thought the song was talking about fear, but the more I sat with it, the more I realized it wasn't. The song was pointing to something much deeper. I hadn't realized I wasn't consciously choosing my response. For years, I had placed my trust in those character defects. I allowed them to sit in the driver's seat while my consciousness took a back seat to my own life. For as long as I can remember, I believed those urges were me. I trusted them because I had never thought to question them. So when they spoke, I obeyed. Then another realization began to emerge. Maybe I wasn't meant to blindly follow those urges. Maybe it wasn't an advisor. Maybe it was simply a mechanism running exactly as it always had. That meant I had spent years giving my authority to something that had never been conscious. It simply repeated what it had always done. The same thoughts, the same fears, the same desires, the same patterns over and over and over again. Then I began reflecting on the words that had greeted me upon awakening. No way to control it. It's totally automatic. Then something began to shift. I realized the problem wasn't the mechanism, the problem was my identification with it. I had allowed it to think for me, to feel for me, to react for me. If that was true, then maybe I wasn't the voice. Maybe I was the one hearing it, the one who could observe it without obeying it. That was a very different way of living. Instead of being carried away by every thought, every emotion, every urge, I could simply observe, not because the mechanism had stopped, but because I had finally stopped identifying with it. For the first time, I began to see the automation wasn't the enemy. It was simply doing what it has always done, running exactly as it always had. The problem wasn't the automation. The problem was I kept handing it the keys. I kept giving it permission to sit in the driver's seat. My consciousness had been riding in the back seat all along. For so many years, I had given the automation my attention. Little by little, I had strengthened it until it began running all by itself. And that's when another image came to mind. The story of Disney's The Sorcerer's Apprentice. The apprentice had access to the tools, but he never learned how to govern them. So they kept working long after they should have stopped. As I reflected, I couldn't help but wonder how many times had I mistaken the tool for the one using it? How many times had I blamed the automation for doing exactly what I had trained it to do? It wasn't rebelling. It wasn't trying to hurt me. It was simply following the conditioning I had spent years reinforcing. Then another realization arose. The apprentice was me. I had been given extraordinary tools, thoughts, emotions, instincts. None of them were ever meant to rule me. They were meant to serve me. Instead, I had spent years serving them. Somewhere along the way, the relationship had become inverted. I wasn't governing the tools, I was allowing the tools to govern me. That realization changed everything. For years, I had craved alcohol, drugs. I was addicted to more of everything. And every time life didn't give me what I wanted, I would unconsciously grind my teeth. The damage hadn't happened overnight, it hadn't occurred over a month or even a year. It had taken decades, decades of craving, decades of tension, decades of unconscious reactions. Little by little, my body had been keeping score. And yet, there I was, convinced my greatest problem was a tooth, when in reality, the tooth had simply become the evidence of decades spent craving, spent grasping, spent clinging, spent living in constant tension. That changed the way I looked at everything. I realized I didn't need another escape. I didn't need another distraction. I didn't need another answer. I needed to stop feeding the craving. 2 days later, I was sitting in the dentist chair. As I waited, I couldn't help but remember fear taking the witness stand, promising to protect me, promising certainty, promising relief. Then the dentist walked in. This was it. Would I believe the same story once again? Would I allow fear to tighten my body? Would I feed the need for certainty? Would I panic because there wasn't time for anesthetic gas? Or would I release the tension that had brought me to this chair? Would I trust the process? Trust the dentist? Trust divinity? Then I prayed. I repeated my mantras. I asked God to direct my thinking. I chose to surrender. Whenever my mind returned to the past dental experiences, I gently brought my attention back to the present moment. Whenever my mind projected future pain or uncertainty, I returned to my breath, back to my mantras, back to prayer, back to the present moment, again and again, until there was only the present moment. Then I heard the drill. Immediately, my mind wanted to project every past experience on to that sound, but I caught it. Rather than running from the sound, I allowed it to become the object of my meditation. I simply observed. The mind had been projecting the past onto the present. I didn't have to believe the projection. I could allow the experience to be exactly as it was. I remained present. The drill was no longer my enemy. It had become my teacher. Each time the mind projected, I saw it. Each time fear arose, I released it. Each time tension returned, I surrendered again. Little by little, the procedure became the practice. For the first time, I saw that suffering had never been in the drill. For years, whenever I heard the drill, that was the cue for my mind to think about pain. There had been times when the anesthetic hadn't worked, so my mind had learned to hear the drill as fear. But that morning, I saw something I had never seen before. I allowed the sound to become the trigger. The fear was already within me. The drill had simply become the catalyst. It had revealed what had already been there. It had exposed the fear, the suffering, and the pain I had been carrying. One of the greatest gifts sobriety has given me is the understanding that so much of my suffering had been self induced. The real work was never out there, it was within, not trying to change the world, but turning my attention inward to what was of my own making. Now, the drill had become an invitation to remain present, to witness the mind as it projected, to watch fear arise without following it, to release the tension before it became suffering. That was the real victory. As I look back, I realized I wasn't just learning how to sit through a dental procedure. I was learning to live. Rather, I was learning to live life on life's terms, not the terms my ego wanted, the terms life was offering me. Life will always present sounds, sensations, thoughts, and circumstances I didn't expect. The question isn't what appears. The question is, can I accept what is without projecting the past or imagining the future? Can I allow this moment to be exactly as it is? Or would I continue to make the same decisions that had created the same suffering? Would I continue to react the way I always had? Or would I respond from presence instead of conditioning? If I choose the latter, then I was no longer feeding the same patterns that had created the same life. Every new response became the beginning of a new life because if I continued to react the way I always had, I would continue to create the same cycle of suffering. The difference wasn't the circumstance, it was whether I accepted what was or continued to resist it. That was the moment I realized fear had never been my teacher. It had been my warden. It had kept me trying to control what could never be controlled, trying to become certain about uncertain future. And the search for certainty had created far more suffering than the dentist ever could. For the first time, I saw that peace was never going to come from certainty. It would come from surrender. Later, I remembered a line in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous that put words to what I had experienced. It says on page 417, and acceptance is the answer to all of my problems today. When I am disturbed, it is because I find some person, place, thing, or situation, some fact of my life unacceptable to me, and I can find no serenity until I accept that person, place, thing, or situation as being exactly the way it's supposed to be at that moment. Nothing, absolutely nothing happens in God's world by mistake. Until I could accept my alcoholism, I could not stay sober. Unless I accept life completely on life's terms, I could not be happy. I need to concentrate not so much on what needs to be changed in the world as what needs to be changed in me and my attitudes. To me, this means that my suffering begins the moment I demand that life be different than it is. Sitting in that dentist chair, I finally understood what acceptance meant. One of the greatest discoveries I had made is that meditation isn't simply about relaxing or quieting the mind. It is about developing the capacity to perceive that which cannot be known through the intellect or through the physical senses alone. And for me, that realization changed so much. The big book had already pointed me toward conscious contact with a higher power. I find myself asking, what comes next? How do I deepen that contact? How do I learn to hear the guidance of divinity more clearly? That question began a new search. That search led me to books and practices that explored meditation in far greater depth. Not because the big book wasn't enough, but because it had already pointed me in the right direction. It had pointed me toward direct contact with divinity. Now, I wanted to learn how to cultivate that contact. The search eventually led me to a book called Life is Meditation, Meditation is Life by Bhante Vimalaramsi. It didn't just teach me how to meditate, it taught me why we suffer, how craving keeps that suffering alive, and how the Noble Eightfold Path offers a practical way to bring that suffering to an end, not as a belief, but as a practice to be tested through direct experience. The Buddha never asked me to believe his teachings. He invited me to practice them, to observe the results, and to see for myself. One of the practices that transformed my life was called the 6R technique, a simple yet profound practice that could be applied not only during meditation, but in the middle of daily life, in the dentist chair, in traffic, during a disagreement, when fear, anger, craving or anxiety arose, rather than becoming identified with what had appeared, I learned to recognize, release, relax, resmile, return, and repeat again and again until the mind lets go. You may have noticed that's exactly what I was doing in the dentist chair. I recognized the fear. I released my attachment to certainty. I relaxed the body. I returned to my breath, to my mantras, to prayer. And when the mind wandered again, I simply repeated the process again and again until there was only the present moment. Little did I know that same practice wouldn't end when I closed my eyes at night or when I opened them in the morning. If you heard me say, one morning in the quiet space between dreaming and waking, as I was returning to my physical body from the dream state, a chorus rose up from the depths of consciousness, or a song from my past impressed itself strongly upon my mind. Those experiences are not simply poetic language. They are the result of a practice that has helped me cultivate awareness while the body is asleep and the consciousness remains awake and aware. That practice is called dream yoga. The book Dream Yoga by Samael Aun Weor became one of the most transformative resources I have ever studied and practiced. He presents a practical method for cultivating awareness while the body is asleep and the consciousness remains awake and aware. A way to continue the work of self observation while the body is asleep. For me, it became another way of deepening conscious contact with divinity. Over time, I began to learn the language of my higher power, a language that couldn't be learned from another person. It had to be discovered through direct experience. For me, it became another way of deepening conscious contact with divinity. Another book that has been deeply meaningful to me is called To Meditate is to See by Padma Mohan. If your deepest longing is to deepen your conscious contact with your higher power, and you don't have a background in Buddhism or esoteric studies, this is probably the first book I would recommend. It begins by helping you understand what meditation actually is. Then it gently walks you through a practical training in stillness, observation, attention, and understanding. Along the way, it explains common obstacles that arise during meditation and offers practical ways to work with them. Rather than simply asking you to believe, the author encourages you to verify these teachings through your own experience. If you find this book helpful, there are many other practical books available on glorian.org. That is spelled glorian.org. Glorian is a nonprofit organization dedicating to preserving and sharing the practical teachings of Samael Aun Weor on several subjects as meditation, self observation, dream yoga, and conscious living. Many of their books are available free of charge through their website or any bookseller like Amazon or, directly through their website. Before I begin to close, I feel it's important that I make something clear. All of these books, websites, and other resources I've mentioned will be linked in the show notes. If you click those links, I will not receive any type of commission whatsoever. I am not an affiliate of any of these authors or organizations. I'm sharing these resources because this is what has genuinely helped me deepen my meditation, experience successive awakenings of consciousness, and cultivate conscious contact with my higher power in a way I never thought possible. My hope is simply that they may help you on your own journey as well. These resources are not meant to help you chase visions, songs, dreams, or extraordinary experiences. Those things may come or they may not. They are not the goal. The goal is to deepen your conscious contact with divinity, to know His will and receive the power to carry that out. For years, I thought step 11 was mostly about talking to God, sharing my fears, my hopes, my desires, and asking for help. And there is certainly a place for that, but over time, my understanding began to deepen. I came to realize that prayer is like picking up the phone and calling a trusted friend. Meditation is like quietly listening when that friend speaks back. Both are necessary for genuine communication. For me, one requires honesty, humility, and surrender, and a willingness to reach out. The other requires receptivity and the willingness to set aside my pride, my personal ambitions, and the character defects that distort my perception and color how I hear the guidance of divinity. The more those defects are seen, comprehended, surrendered, and gradually eradicated, the clearer the guidance becomes. Not because divinity begins speaking more loudly, but because there is less of my ego standing in the way. Today, I still ask God to direct my thinking. I ask Him to sit in the driver's seat of my life. The best way I know to describe it is like an internal GPS. My spiritual ears remain open to His guidance. The clearer the channel, the easier it becomes to recognize that guidance. I also want to include two final resources. The first is a guided practice of the 7 mantra vowels. It's about an hour long, and over time, it helped me memorize the 7 vowel mantras so I could incorporate them into my daily practice. For me, this practice has become another way of cultivating greater receptivity and strengthening my spiritual senses. The second is a lecture by the master Samael Aun Weor, The Transformation of Impressions. That is the title. You can find that lecture from glorion.org. It offers a deeper understanding of one of the central principles we've explored throughout this episode. If these resources resonate with you, I hope they serve you as they have served me. One last thought. You may have noticed during my time in the dental chair, I chose to repeat a mantra. The Sanskrit word for mantra means mind protection. For me, that also implies spiritual defense. In that moment, I wasn't, rather, in that moment, I, it wasn't about escaping the experience. It was about protecting my mind from fear, from negative thinking, from the need for certainty, and from identifying with the ego. Instead, it helped me remain present, connected, and receptive to the guidance of divinity. I will also include a video in the show notes that expands on this practice. Looking back, I can see that this was never really a story about my tooth. The story was simply, or better said, the tooth was simply the consequence of something deeper. It began long before I ever sat down in the dentist chair. It began with craving, the endless search for more drugs, more alcohol, more certainty, more security, more comfort, believing that something outside of myself would finally bring lasting peace. But every time I found what I thought I was looking for, another craving took its place. And eventually, that same craving gave rise to fear, the fear of pain, the fear of uncertainty, the fear of not getting what I wanted or losing what I already had. I finally came to see that the dentist was never the cause of my suffering. The fear, the pain, and the surrender required during that procedure revealed the very source that had led me to saw off half of my tooth in the first place.